Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast, where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today, we are walking through a case that is less about finding the person responsible for a death and entirely about systemic failures that really set the scene for tragedy.
It's arguably one of the most haunting questions in California's recent history. I mean, why was a young woman already showing clear signs of acute mental distress released alone into the dark, remote hills of Malibu at midnight?
With nothing.
Exactly. No resources, no car, no way to call for help. And the biggest question, why did she never make it home?
That's really the core of the issue we need to unpack today. We're exploring the disappearance and death of Mitrice Richardson back in 2009.
Yeah.
Our focus here, our mission, if you will, is to dissect that thread of truth regarding accountability. We need to examine the protocol failures, the alleged cover-ups, and just the profoundly questionable decisions made by law enforcement.
Decisions that turned what should have been a minor civil disturbance, maybe a welfare check, into this catastrophic permanent loss.
What's really striking here is how the focus shifted almost immediately. It wasn't just about finding a missing person.
No, it quickly became a critical examination of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department itself. The investigation's primary subject really became institutional negligence.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. We need to understand who Mitrice Richardson was and the context, the atmosphere of that fateful night.
Mitrice Richardson. She was a young woman with just immense potential. At the time she disappeared, she was 24 years old, born in 1985.
Educated too, right?
Very much so. She had a degree in psychology from Cal State Fullerton. And she had dreams, aspirations. She wanted to be an executive assistant. She was a dancer. You know, she wasn't someone adrift. She had goals, a network.
And it was that network, her family, that immediately raised red flags about her state leading up to this.
They did. Her family, who obviously knew her best, had really grave concerns. They strongly believed she was potentially suffering from a bipolar episode or perhaps some other form of acute mental health crisis.
So that context, her vulnerability, was known or at least strongly suspected by those closest to her before the police even got involved that night.
Absolutely. And that's crucial context for understanding the decisions that followed.
Which brings us to the incident that really kicked off this whole chain of events. September 16, 2009, at Jeffrey's restaurant in Malibu. What exactly happened there? What led to her arrest?
Well, the reports from the restaurant staff, they paint a pretty disturbing picture. Mitrice was acting what they described as bizarrely erratic.
Layout.
She allegedly spent time talking about very deep, maybe disconnected subjects, things like messages from God, astrology. She was apparently even conversing with people who weren't there. Her behavior was, clearly suggestive of someone maybe undergoing a significant psychotic break or some kind of mental health spiral.
Okay, so despite these, let's call them clear indicators of psychological distress, the actual charge she was arrested for seems almost mundane in comparison.
It really does. The official charge was defrauding an innkeeper, basically failing to pay her $89 meal bill.
$89.
$89. She was also charged with possessing a small amount of marijuana, less than an ounce. But this right here is where the narrative becomes so deeply troubling.
How so?
Because these monumental, life-altering consequences that followed were triggered by an incredibly trivial infraction. She was showing signs of, profound mental disorientation, and the police response appears to have been purely punitive, not protective.
Yeah, this triviality versus the severity of the consequence, it anchors so much of the family's later criticism, doesn't it?
Completely. And because of this minor charge, the LASD immediately impounded her vehicle.
Which wasn't just taking her car.
No, this action essentially stripped her of everything. The moment that tow truck hooked up her car, all her vital personal belongings, her phone, her purse, her ID, her money, were locked inside that vehicle.
So when they released her hours later,
she literally had nothing on her. No way to call anyone, no money to buy a bus ticket, assuming one even ran there at that hour, no ID, nothing, no shelter.
Okay, this sets the stage for the moment that really defines this entire case. The controversial release, September 17th, 2009.
Yeah, the time and the place of the release. Just the two most, you could say, unforgivable details here. She was released at 12:28 a.m.
Just after midnight.
In the dead of night, yes.
Yeah.
From the Malibu Los Hills Sheriff's Station. Now, it's critical. Absolutely critical to understand the geography here.
Right. This wasn't a station in a busy part of town.
Not at all. It's located in Agora Hills, technically, but it sits in a really remote, rugged, sparsely populated, unlit part of Malibu Canyon. There are no readily available taxis just waiting around, no 24-hour bus services nearby.
And the nearest homes are how far?
Miles away, really, down these winding, dark canyon roads. It's not a place you'd want to be walking alone at night under any circumstances, let alone
In her potential state with no phone or money. So she was placed in a situation where she was utterly vulnerable, mentally compromised, alone in the dark, zero resources. How on earth did the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department justify this? What was their rationale?
Well, the official LASD stance was and remained highly defensive. They maintained they simply followed the existing protocol at the time.
Protocol.
They claim that during her short time in custody, she exhibited no signs of mental illness that would warrant a mandatory Welfare and Institutions Code Section 5150 hold.
That's the 72-hour involuntary psychiatric commitment.
Exactly. They also insisted that they offered her the chance to wait in the station lobby until morning or to use the phone, and that she declined those offers.
Okay, but the reliability of her refusal, if she refused, given her alleged mental state at the restaurant just hours before, that itself seems like a huge ethical question. A legal one, possibly.
It's a massive question mark, and their official claim it stands in direct, stark contradiction to the desperate plea made by her own family, her mother.
This is maybe the most critical point of failure, isn't it? The direct warning they received.
It has to be considered the moment of highest accountability failure, yes. Mitrice's mother, Lettice Sutton, had actually contacted the station. She called specifically because she was terrified for her daughter's well-being.
What did you tell them?
She expressed extreme concern over Mitrice's fragile mental state, and she explicitly pleaded that the sheriff's department hold her daughter until the morning.
Which would have allowed her time to get there.
Exactly. It would have allowed Lettice to come and safely transport Mitrice home. The LASD chose to ignore that direct, informed warning from a deeply concerned family member.
So the LASD's failure or refusal to invoke that 5150 hold, despite, pretty clear evidence of bizarre, possibly self-destructive behavior at the restaurant and this direct family warning. That's the cornerstone of the institutional negligence argument.
It really is. A 5150 hold requires an individual to be deemed a danger to themselves or others, or what's called gravely disabled.
And arguably her behavior fit that.
You could certainly argue that. Talking about messages from God, acting erratically, being unable to manage a simple transaction, like paying a bill due to apparent mental confusion, in any compassionate or even just cautious interpretation, that should meet the criteria for at least a strong evaluation, if not an immediate hold.
But they didn't see it that way.
By claiming she exhibited no signs of illness in the station, they were effectively sidestepping the criteria that would have legally protected her. It feels like they chose paperwork convenience, or maybe avoiding the hassle of a 5150 over her personal safety.
So after being released into the canyon at 12:28 a.m., she just vanished into the night.
Mm-hmm.
But there was one final brief encounter hours later, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. Around 6:30 a.m., so roughly 6 hours after her release, she was spotted. This was approximately 6 miles away from the sheriff's station, geographically.
6 miles on foot, in the dark, through the canyon.
Presumably. This sighting occurred in the backyard of a retired news anchor who lived in Montanito, which is a very rugged, rural residential area within the Santa Monica Mountains.
Still wandering then. Seemingly confused, probably exhausted. What did she say to the homeowner? Did they interact?
They did, briefly. She reportedly told the homeowner that she was just resting. Now, the anchor, sensitive to the situation, seeing a young woman alone in the hills at dawn, recognized the inherent vulnerability.
And called the police.
Called the police, yes. But this is another instance where the system seems to fail her. By the time the deputies arrived, and there seems to have been some delay, she was gone.
So that fleeting moment of human contact, that was the last reliable sighting anyone had of Mitrice Richardson.
That's correct. The last time anyone could definitively say they saw her alive.
The search then obviously turned into a full-blown missing person investigation. But it wasn't until nearly a year later, tragically, that the final chapter was written.
Yeah, the discovery itself was almost accidental. It was made on August 9th, 2010. park rangers who were actually searching for illegal marijuana grows in a completely different area stumbled upon her remains.
And the location?
It was a place called Dark Canyon within the Santa Monica Mountains, about 7 miles as the crow flies from the Lost Hill station where she was released.
And the condition of the remains. This was incredibly disturbing, wasn't it?
Right.
It immediately fueled a lot of public and family suspicion.
Absolutely. What the rangers found were her naked, mummified skeletal remains, located near a creek bed in this remote canyon. Naked. And when the LA County coroner eventually issued their official ruling, they cited the cause of death as undetermined.
Undetermined. Not accidental, not homicide, just unknown.
Correct. They stated they found no conclusive signs of foul play, meaning no obvious trauma like gunshot wounds or fractures, based on the limited skeletal evidence they were able to examine.
But that lack of finding, that doesn't mean foul play didn't happen, does it?
Not at all. It simply means they couldn't definitively prove it based on the evidence they possessed. And, as we're about to discuss, the state of that evidence itself became a major point of contention. It was critically compromised. Hashtag internet theories and cultural interpretations.
Right. So when you have an official cause of death left as undetermined in a case that's already fraught with so much institutional failure, well, that vacuum gets filled immediately, doesn't it? Filled with theories, speculation, and intense public scrutiny.
Oh, absolutely. And the theory that really anchors almost every discussion of this case is, naturally, law enforcement negligence.
It feels unavoidable.
It's the unavoidable central point. Regardless of the specific mechanism of her death, whether she fell, was attacked, or tragically succumbed to the elements, the decision to release her.
That initial decision.
Releasing a clearly vulnerable woman, exhibiting erratic behavior with absolutely no means of safety or communication, and critically, against her own mother's specific informed plea, releasing her alone at 12:28 a.m. into a remote, unlit, dangerous canyon area. That was the central fatal failure.
So the question shifts, doesn't it? It's less who killed her, potentially, and more who created the conditions that led to her death. The negligence itself feels like the core institutional crime that almost everyone could agree upon.
Precisely. If she had simply been held for those extra 6 or 7 hours, as her mother requested, she would likely have been safely picked up. Her death, in all probability, would have been prevented.
So the who let her die question, it really focuses on that institutional accountability for prioritizing what? Internal protocol over basic human safety.
That's the argument, yes. A failure of duty of care at the most fundamental level.
Okay, let's explore the theory that tries to explain how she might have died after leaving the station. The idea of a mental health crisis leading to an accidental death. This is sometimes called a hybrid theory, right?
Yes, and it's a narrative that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Sheriff's Department has seemed at times to subtly encourage as it shifts focus away from their actions.
What's the evidence for this theory?
Well, it draws heavily on the, frankly, overwhelming evidence of her apparent psychotic break. You have the bizarre behavior reported at Jeffries. The family stated concerns about a possible bipolar episode.
Right.
The mechanism suggested by this theory is that she simply wandered off into the rugged, dangerous terrain while in a manic, disoriented, or confused state, and eventually succumbed to the elements. Exposure, essentially.
But then there's the detail of the remains being found naked.
Yeah.
That makes this theory incredibly difficult for many people, myself included, to just accept without suspicion. It feels counterintuitive if it was just an accident.
It does feel counterintuitive initially, and this is where we need to bring in a specific, perhaps less commonly known forensic concept, paradoxical undressing.
Paradoxical undressing. Okay, what is that?
It's a documented phenomenon associated with severe, often terminal hypothermia. As the body's core temperature drops drastically, the brain becomes severely disoriented. And crucially, it can trigger a sensation of intense burning heat just moments before death.
So the person feels like they're overheating even as they're freezing.
Exactly. And in this confused, paradoxical state, the victim involuntarily starts stripping off their clothing, trying to cool down.
So the finding that her skeletal remains were naked, which immediately makes the public think homicide or sexual assault, could actually be clinical evidence of a specific type of accidental death due to environmental exposure and hypothermia.
It could be, yes. It provides a potential scientific explanation for the nudity that doesn't rely on foul play. It lends some credence to the theory that she might have tragically died of exposure out there in the canyon.
Look,
But a couple of caveats. First, while this explanation is scientifically plausible, it's often deeply unsatisfying to the public and especially the family because, again, it doesn't absolve the LASD for the initial negligence that put her in that environment in the first place.
right, it explains maybe how, but not why she was there to begin with.
Precisely. And second, Mitrice's remains were found in August. Now, Malibu Canyon can get cool at night, even chilly, but severe hypothermia leading to paradoxical undressing is typically associated with much colder conditions. So for this theory to hold, proponents have to argue she likely died much earlier, perhaps closer to her disappearance in September of the previous year, when night temperatures might have been lower.
It requires some assumptions.
It requires some assumptions about the timing of her death that we just don't have evidence for.
Okay, so the fact remains that the family, and many critics online and elsewhere, simply cannot accept the accidental death ruling, especially given the circumstances, which leads us directly to the foul play theories, homicide or maybe abduction.
And the arguments for foul play are, compelling, even if they remain unproven forensically. You have the extreme remoteness of the location where she was found. You have the vulnerability of the victim young woman alone, possibly disoriented. And you have that detail of the naked remains, which, despite the paradoxical undressing theory, still strongly suggests to many an interaction with another person, an assault, or an attempt to conceal identity or evidence.
So what kind of foul play was being theorized?
Online discussions, and certainly the family's beliefs, immediately raised suspicions across the spectrum. Was it perhaps a local predator who knew the canyons? Was it somehow related to human trafficking given the remoteness? Or, and this was a particularly painful and explosive theory, was it potentially someone connected to the very agency that had last held her in custody?
The suspicion of police involvement. That unfortunately gained traction, didn't it? Fueled heavily by the department's own later actions regarding evidence handling, which we definitely need to detail shortly.
Yes, their actions created fertile ground for that suspicion. But sticking just to the foul play theory itself, the biggest challenge remains that official coroner's ruling.
The undetermined cause of death.
Right. Despite the profound suspicion and the circumstantial arguments, the official examination found no definitive blunt force trauma, no stab wounds, no gunshot evidence on the skeletal remains they examined. However, and this is a huge however, we have to remember the state of those remains and the scene itself.
Is compromised.
Severely compromised. So finding subtle evidence, things like DNA, trace material, soft tissue injury evidence, that became virtually impossible. So while definitive proof of homicide is absent from the official report, the possibility is certainly not eliminated by it.
Beyond the specifics of what might have happened to her physically, Mitrice's tragedy very quickly transcended being just a typical, albeit tragic, missing persons case. It became a focal point for much larger issues, didn't it? A piece of cultural and systemic commentary.
Oh, absolutely. Her case became a real rallying point for activists for the community, focusing on primarily two interconnected issues. First, the systemic failure of law enforcement, not just LASD, but more broadly, to treat mental health crises as medical emergencies, rather than simply as minor criminal behavior or disturbances.
And the second issue.
The second, and deeply intertwined issue, was that of potential racial bias. The differential handling, critics argued, of vulnerable minorities when they are in law enforcement custody, especially when exhibiting signs of mental distress.
So the argument essentially was that a young white woman, perhaps from a more affluent background, displaying similar behavior at Jeffries, might have been treated very differently, maybe seen as a runaway or a medical patient needing help.
That's the core of the cultural critique, yes. That she might have been evaluated more thoroughly, certainly held until family arrived, whereas Mitrice, as a young woman of color, was perceived differently and summarily released into extreme danger.
So the family and activists really characterized the entire situation as this tragic cascade of failures. A vulnerable person failed by the system at every single possible juncture.
Exactly. From that initial decision to arrest her over an $89 bill instead of getting her help, to the refusal or failure to use the established psychiatric hold protocols like the 5150, right through to that final fatal release decision. The negligence wasn't just one bad call, they argued. It was systematic. and potentially fueled by a lack of compassion, maybe implicit bias, and certainly a rigid adherence to protocol over common sense and safety. Hashtag analysis and systemic accountability.
Okay, now we get to the part of the story that truly infuriates critics and, frankly, undermines any faith one might want to have in the initial investigation. These are the actions of the sheriff's department after Mitrice vanished. The thread of truth here seems to get deliberately twisted and obscured.
Yeah, this is where the focus shifts away from speculating about what might have happened in the canyon and lands squarely on the documented actions or inactions of public officials. Let's start with what feels like immediate obstruction: the withholding of key evidence, specifically that jail video footage.
Right. Captain Tom Martin, who was the head of the Lost Hills station at the time, initially flat out denied that any jail video existed showing Mitrice leaving the station.
Oh.
Why? Why lie about something seemingly so basic?
Well, the initial denial did a couple of things. It created a period of complete obfuscation, kind of a fog around her release, and it bought the department time. In any investigation, especially involving law enforcement, denying the existence of video footage when it likely exists, that's a massive red flag.
It suggests control of the narrative.
Precisely. It implies they're trying to control the narrative by controlling the evidence. Perhaps they were trying to minimize the appearance of just how vulnerable she was, walking out alone into the pitch black.
But the pressure didn't let up. From the family, from the media. Eventually, Captain Martin had to admit the video did exist. And what that footage reportedly showed, well, it immediately turned the theory of simple negligence into one of potential cover-up for many people.
That's exactly right, because the video reportedly showed a deputy's car leaving the station parking lot just 2 minutes after Mitrice walked out into the dark. 2 minutes.
Okay, the LASD's explanation for that.
The LASD maintained that the deputy was simply driving home at the end of his shift, took the same exit route, and had absolutely no contact with her. A coincidence of timing.
But for critics, especially the family, that 2-minute window wasn't just a coincidence. It created immense suspicion. Why? What's so significant about 2 minutes?
Because it places a law enforcement official, someone from the very station that just released her in the exact same remote location, potentially traveling the same dark canyon road, in the immediate moments after her release. Now, if the LASD was being truly transparent, you'd think they would have welcomed a full open investigation into that deputy's movements, his road home, just to clear the air. But the fact that they initially denied the video existed, that suggested to critics they were actively trying to conceal that 2-minute proximity.
So the initial dishonesty poisoned the well for the later explanation.
Exactly. It fueled the family's deep suspicion that maybe some other interaction, something concealed, might have occurred after she left the station grounds. Whether that's fair or not, the institutional dishonesty created that suspicion, overshadowing the possibility of it just being a simple coincidence.
But the alleged cover-up, or at least the profound mishandling of the case, didn't end with the video situation. When her remains were finally found, almost a year later, the department's actions at the scene. They effectively destroyed any real chance of finding definitive criminal truths, didn't they? This involves the just egregious mishandling of the remains.
This is arguably the most devastating systematic failure relating to the investigation itself. When her skeletal remains were discovered there in Dark Canyon, sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene first. And according to subsequent reports and investigations, they moved the remains before the LA County coroner's investigators could arrive and conduct a full, proper forensic examination of the scene in situ.
Moving the remains. I mean, that's forensics 101, isn't it? You don't touch the body until the coroner gets there. It's a fundamental violation of the standard crime scene protocol.
Absolutely fundamental. Moving the remains compromises everything. The precise location, the position of the bones, the relationship of the body to the immediate surrounding environment, the soil, the vegetation, any potential trace evidence nearby.
It destroys the context.
Completely. In forensic investigations, context is everything. Was the body dumped there? Did she fall? Was there evidence of a struggle nearby? The position, the state of the ground underneath and around, that's critical. By moving the remains, the deputies essentially destroyed the integrity of that scene.
And eliminated the chance to find crucial trace evidence.
Exactly. Tiny things, hairs, fibers from clothing, maybe shoe prints nearby, non-native soil things that might have pointed to an assailant or perhaps confirmed an accidental fall. All that potential evidence was compromised or lost.
What was their justification for doing something so catastrophic to the investigation?
The deputies reportedly claimed it was due to poor communication, some confusion about procedures perhaps, and also a stated fear that local wildlife coyotes, maybe bears in the area, might disturb or destroy the evidence further if they waited.
But the consequence?
The consequence was immediate and permanent. The ability to definitively determine the cause of death or find concrete evidence of foul play was severely, irrevocably compromised. This action, more than perhaps any other, solidified the family's painful belief that they would likely never receive the full truth, not because of a sophisticated criminal hiding their tracks, but because of institutional incompetence or perhaps even deliberate obfuscation by the authorities themselves.
So the result of all this compromised evidence, the questionable release, the video issue, it meant that while there was intense public outcry and demand for criminal charges against anyone, the lack of definitive forensic proof made that virtually impossible.
That's right. Criminal accountability seemed off the table due to the state of the evidence. But the family did pursue justice where they could, which was in civil court.
They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against LA County.
They did. And eventually, LA County settled that case, paying $900,000 to the Richardson family.
It's important, though, to stress the distinction here, isn't it? A civil settlement isn't the same as a criminal conviction or even an admission of criminal wrongdoing.
Not at all. That's a crucial distinction. The county settled the case, crucially, without admitting any criminal wrongdoing by any employee. The settlement essentially functions as a legal mechanism to compensate the family for the LASD's proven negligence. That is, the failure in their basic duty of care by releasing Mitrice into such a hazardous situation without resources.
So it paid for the harm caused by those institutional failures.
Yes, but it completely sidestepped the question of whether any individual deputy or officer should face criminal charges, either related to the events of that night or the subsequent evidence handling. That door, the door to criminal accountability, remains firmly closed.
So if this case didn't result in criminal convictions, what is its legacy? Did anything change because of this tragedy? Did it have any impact on police policy?
It absolutely did have an impact, albeit one born from tragedy. Mitrice's case stands as a profound and, frankly, indelible scar on the record of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Her death forced a kind of institutional reckoning, at least on paper.
Oh, so?
Her death directly spurred significant changes in police release policies, not just within LASD, but as a model for discussion elsewhere. It significantly increased awareness, or at least mandated awareness, regarding the proper handling of individuals exhibiting signs of mental health distress while in custody, particularly concerning the assessment for and implementation of the 5150 hold.
The procedures were changed.
Yes. The LASD was forced to revise its procedures for releasing individuals, especially those who lack resources like a phone or money, or show signs of impairment or mental distress. The goal was to ensure, hopefully, that the next vulnerable person isn't just abandoned to the wilderness at midnight.
But even with those policy changes, which came too late for Mitrice, the core questions, the enduring questions, they still just loom over Dark Canyon and the Lost Hills station, don't they?
They absolutely do. They remain fundamentally unanswered, swirling in that space between negligence and potential foul play. We're still left asking, what truly happened to her in those hours between the last sighting at 6:30 a.m. and whenever she died? Was she really alone out there in the canyon?
And that deputy.
And was the deputy who left just 2 minutes after her truly irrelevant to her fate, just a coincidence? And perhaps most fundamentally, why did the department initially obstruct the release of that video? And then why did they actively compromise the only chance at finding forensic truth at the recovery scene? The full institutional truth, it feels, remains obscured, possibly deliberately, by the very people sworn to find and uphold it. #outro.
The case of Mitrice Richardson is just a searing example, isn't it, of institutional negligence seemingly overriding duty, common sense, and basic human compassion. It's a mystery where the initial tragedy, her disappearance and death, is almost overshadowed by the subsequent devastating failures of the people who were sworn to protect her.
It really is. That profound lack of procedural integrity, it's staggering. From that initial refusal, apparently, to acknowledge the severity of her mental health crisis to the what seems like calculated denial of the jail video, and then the just horrific, unforgivable mishandling of her remains. It all means her family may never get the kind of closure that they so desperately needed and deserved.
Her body was found eventually.
Her body was found, yes. But the truth about her final hours, her final moments, that seems to remain hidden. Not necessarily by nature or a cunning perpetrator, but potentially by the actions and inactions of those who perhaps prioritized protecting the institution over finding justice for her.
Mitrice's story really compels us to ask, if she was failed so profoundly at every turn by the authorities responsible for her safety, was she ultimately just a victim of the elements in that canyon? Or did that institutional indifference make her a victim of something far more sinister? We encourage you to continue the conversation and explore the implications of this case on our social media platforms using #ThreadsOfTruth and #JusticeForMitrice.
Next time on Threads of Truth, we look at the unsettling case of Dorothy Jane Scott, a young woman who vanished after months of being stalked by an unknown caller, and whose story really blurs the line between fear and fate.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration. We'll see you next week.